We are zoning amendment bylaw 1851, Bill 44 housing amendments, and I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Katerniak. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, directors. My name is Anna Koternik. I'm a planner analyst at the SLRD, and today I will give you a brief presentation regarding a number of items, first of which is Electoral Area A zoning bylaw amendment number 1851 2024. So this is an amendment to the Electoral Area A zoning bylaw in response to Bill 44. It's a provincial bill that sets out regulations for local governments regarding mandatory increase in density in residential zones. This bill has a greater impact on larger metropolitan areas and our urban neighborhoods. And Electoral Area A, the applicable requirements is that the zoning bylaw allows at least a secondary suite and or an accessory dwelling unit in addition to a dwelling unit. So to summarize the changes being proposed to Electoral Area A zoning bylaw under this amendment is that we will be revising the definition of a secondary suite to increase maximum suite size from 90 square meters to 110 square meters. This unit size increase is aimed at creating more family-friendly rentals. The secondary suite use will be permitted in all residential parcels in Electoral Area A. We're also proposing to add a definition of accessory dwelling units and allow this use on all residential parcels of 1 hectare or greater. This use will also be available as an option on smaller lots serviced by community sewer and water. So lots under 1 hectare, such as Braylorn. And so what I mean by this will be an option is that people will be allowed to choose between a secondary suite and accessory dwelling unit. So they would be able to choose one. And lastly, we're proposing to increase height and set a maximum parcel coverage in line with the provincial policy manual and site standards. So we're requesting that the bylaw is given for second and third reading and be sent to the Ministry of Transportation for approval. Note that this public hearing are prohibited with respect to amendments related to the implementation of Bill 44 requirements. And so that concludes the summary for Electoral Area A under bylaw 1851 2024. Let me know if you have any questions.
Are there any questions from anybody?
Can we move both at once? So I'll move both to that.
Director
Okay.
Maris, both that, seconded by Director Rainbow.
Any comments? I'll call the question. All in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We'll now move on to 1852, same Bill 44 housing amendments. This is applying to Area B. Any significant differences, Ms. Katerniak, between A and B?
Thank you, Chair. There are no zones in Electoral Area B that have community sewer and water. So basically the same changes as Electoral Area A, except for lots of 1 hectare or greater only. So accessory dwelling units will not be available for lots under 1 hectare. That is the main change, yeah.
Okay. Questions? No? Okay. Would anyone like to move it? Moved by Director Birch Jones. Comments? Seeing none, we'll call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries.
Area C.
Area C, Bill 44 housing amendments. Ms. Katerniak, any significant differences between the previous two and this one?
Thank you, Chair. I think Alex McKay will
Oh.
speak to this one.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So good afternoon, Alex McKay, planner with the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District. So this is regarding the changes for Area C. I'll just go over the key proposed amendments really quickly, and then I'll also speak to some public comments that were received with respect to Area C, and then happy to take any questions that there are.
Okay.
So if you want to follow along, this is on page 7 of my report or page 85 of your agenda package. So in terms of the overall amendments, similar to the other areas, carriage home is now proposed to fall under the new accessory dwelling unit definition and provisions. That's strictly a terminology change. It's not changing the use itself. Height provisions are proposed to be amended throughout the bylaw. So that's to amend principal buildings to 11 meters as the maximum height. That would include single family dwellings as well as duplexes. Accessory dwelling units, we're setting a maximum height of 8 meters. And I should say this is all to do specifically with the residential primary zone. So doesn't apply to things like industrial zones. We're also proposing that we amend setbacks in line with the recommended provincial site standards in zones where accessory dwelling unit is being added as a permitted use. In terms of the general regulations, similar to the other areas, we're proposing that the maximum GFA for both secondary suites and accessory dwelling units be amended. That's currently set at 90 square meters. We're recommending going to 110 in order to allow for a broader range, basically of housing types and potentially more rental housing that's suitable for families. We're also introducing some accessory dwelling unit and secondary suite provisions in the general regulations. In Area C for parking and loading, there is currently no requirement for parking for accessory dwelling units. So we've added a requirement for 1 additional parking space in those cases. And then in terms of uses, what's changing for Area C? So secondary suites were now required, as Ms. Katerniak probably spoke to, we're required to allow for either secondary suites or accessory dwelling units in all residential primary zones. And it's at our discretion whether we allow for both in some cases. So for Area C, there's 3 zones where we currently, they're currently residential primary zones that didn't allow for either. And we're proposing adding secondary suites as a permitted use in those zones. All 3 of those are former land use contract zones. So it's Ponderosa, McGillivray Falls, and Birkenhead Estates. Then we're proposing that accessory dwelling units be added as a permitted use on parcels that are over 1 hectare in the following zones. So that would be RR1 and subzones, RR2 and RR3. So that affects just over 500 parcels in those areas. And then finally, with respect to the CD1 zone in Wedgwood, so carriage homes will now fall under that accessory dwelling unit definition. And then importantly, what we're proposing is changing the provisions that currently exist, which require the gross floor area for a secondary suite, for an accessory dwelling unit to be subtracted from the gross floor area maximum for the principal residence. We're proposing removing that, and that is just to allow any homeowner that has already potentially built their primary residence right out to the maximum GFA to be able to add a rental dwelling unit on their property in the form of an ADU. In terms of public comment, the public comments we received for Area C were specifically to do with Wedgwoods from an architect who works there or works on a number of properties there. In general, they indicated they were very supportive of the overall proposed approach. They did suggest not subtracting the GFA for secondary suites in addition to not subtracting the ADU GFA, but staff are not recommending that approach. Essentially, the spirit of this change under Bill 44 is to support housing. We're already allowing for the ADU to be constructed in addition to a principal residence that's right up at the GFA maximum. And these are very large homes. So I think with a secondary suite, it could potentially be retrofitted within the existing footprint. So that's what staff would recommend there. I'll leave it there and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Director Pettigill, Director Crompton, and then Director Hunt.
Yes, for this question applies to areas C and D. Unlike A and B, there's a few areas, and they're, as far as I can tell, non-settlement areas we're allowing for an ADU that Bill 44 doesn't require us. And I'm curious about our rationale because it seems to, that particular change seems to direct density to non-settlement areas, which I thought was sort of contrary to the direction we're trying to go. Everything else kind of makes sense to me, but that one piece I wasn't sure about. I'm just wondering if staff can clarify the rationale behind that particular change.
Yes, thank you. So through the chair, I can speak to Area C. I'll leave it to Ms. Dewar to speak to, or Ms. Dewar to speak to Area D. But I believe you're speaking about the RR1, RR2, and RR3 parcels. So many of those parcels do allow for cottages or other types of additional residential uses as they currently stand. So we see this as just providing a bit of flexibility. So it will allow property owners, they could do the cottage or they could do the accessory dwelling unit. We've only allowed for it on parcels over 1 hectare, which is in line with the provincial recommendations that we don't look at that density on the smaller parcels in rural areas where they're not serviced. Hopefully that answers your question. Thank you.
How much of this, as it relates to regional districts, is discretionary and how much of it is required?
So in the case of Area C, thank you through the chair, there's very little in this that is discretionary. It's only what the previous question alluded to. So cases where we are allowing for an accessory dwelling unit in addition to a suite. We are required to allow for one of those two. So we have to allow for either a secondary suite or an accessory dwelling unit. Allowing for both is at our discretion.
Thank you.
We're not compromising the province's mandate in any way, that we're following what they want.
Yes, thank you through the chair. So these amendments will bring our zoning into alignment with the provincial legislative changes that we're required to make by June 30th.
Thank you.
Okay. No other questions in the room? I have a question, Ms. Mackay, about the required additional parking space. Is that a part of this requirement from the province, or is that us asking for those additional parking spaces to address concerns about parking beyond what's already provided by the current zoning?
Okay, so thank you. I would say that is a little bit of a gap in our existing zoning bylaw, that we haven't required a parking space for accessory dwelling units. So it's to address that. It isn't required by the province. It is recommended in their site standards. And I think in Area C, all of the parcels on which those will potentially land are quite rural in nature. So we do want to make sure there's somewhere for the vehicle to land on the property, but that's why that's being added.
Okay, and you don't see this as being this won't prohibit anybody from doing what they want to do. This is like, these are on large lots where there's likely going to be room for more than one parking space anyway. This is just a minimum one parking space, just to ensure that those, like, why are we even, maybe we can just let it go. I'm not saying I'm trying to be like, oh, let's not have parking, because I do have that conversation all the time. But in this case, is this a prohibitive move that may have someone say, I'm not going to do it because I need that extra parking space?
Thank you. I think in most cases, it's very unlikely to be prohibitive. There might be some parcels in Wedgwoods where it's a little bit trickier to fit all of the required parking spaces, but I don't think that if we were to strip it out entirely, those vehicles will then need to park on the street in the cases of rental housing. So I think it is probably better to require that it lands on the property itself, so that we don't have those kind of spillover impacts. I think it's unlikely to be so prohibitive that someone wouldn't go ahead and find a way to make it work within the constraints of their property, because as you said, they're quite large parcels.
Yeah. So is there a way of making this like building site specific based on, oh, that site is going to be small, therefore you can either put in a larger yard or a parking space, but we like, we know that there's no parking on the roads in Wedgewoods anyway. So the concern that rental cars or renters or owners buy lots of
Yes.
vehicles too when they can afford to, so they do. And so is there a way that we can put this on as like an extra based on each case so that it's not codified in like you have to build this many parking spaces? I'm not trying to drag this out. I'm just really cautious about making this the standard, not the exception.
I think what we could do is thank you, or through the chair rather, we could look at doing it for individual zones. So it could only apply, for example, in the CD1 zone, and we could not worry about requiring parking for the other rural properties. I don't know if Director Needham is in the room there. If she has anything to add to this, she might have some other thoughts around it.
She is.
Yeah, I think what Ms. Mackay is proposing would be workable. We can't make zoning discretionary though.
That's fair.
And Jen, you have Director Mack and Director Herbert.
Instead of specifically saying parking space, why don't we just say that all vehicles have to be parked on the property? So you're not parking on the street. Because you take parcels out in Bull Creek, Divine, Darcy, wherever, there's more than enough room to park 2, 4, 6, 8, vehicles on a lot because the lots are, not, big enough in size. So, yeah, I don't think we should be being restrictive in that way or specifically saying you need to provide, one extra spot. Just say they all need to be parked on the property. Because more than likely to have more than one vehicle. So if you have the owners of the property and then the next property, you potentially have 4 vehicles. So. And they may all be electric.
Is that right to get your buy-in?
Yeah.
And Director Herbert.
Thank you. Yeah, this is an interesting one in the rural context for this parking requirement. I wonder, that's something that could be varied if this ended up being something that was challenging for an applicant, correct? So and that process is fairly well defined, from my understanding. So, because I was contemplating whether we put something specifically in and whether that's a threshold that we could delegate to staff to make that process a little bit easier and less onerous. So maybe what about that mechanism to address this? Because I think, I think I see where we're going here, but is there something that is the standard process for seeking variance to this suitable here? Or is there something that we could do to make that a little bit easier to reflect that case piece? And the general spirit of this is streamlining, so.
Yes, through the chair. As Ms. Mackay noted, it's very unlikely that anyone is going to confront a situation where they can't meet the parking requirements. And in the cases that they can't, there is a variance provision. We don't have a delegated authority to myself for approving variances, but it is something that I would like to bring forward for minor type variances like that. So yes, the variance process is available.
My name is Claire Dewar. I'm a senior planner here at the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District. I wanted to add a bit of context that I will get into with respect to the Area D bylaw, but it pertains to the parking discussion here, and we are recommending a policy be added to the official community plan with respect to off-street parking requirements being reduced once transit service is in place. So this would be particularly relevant to City of Wedgwoods and some communities in Howe Sound East, less to some of our more rural areas, but it's basically acknowledging that if we don't have transportation options at this time, we do need parking as we have snow clearing and other considerations. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation that we could see things make need to look differently in the future if we have more transportation options.
Thank you. Oh, Dr. Whittingham.
Yeah, that last, I appreciate last comment through what I was gonna say off a little bit, but I guess, I wasn't so worried about parking, thinking it was all rural areas for area C, not realizing it was Wedgwood, which to my recollection, we've done a fair bit of work to try and make sure transit is viable there. And because of that, I didn't want to require parking, and I was gonna get into that for area D. I'm a little bit torn about sort of requiring it until there's transit, because there's also the behavior thing, and there's a part of me that says, let's not have it, not require it. To the degree people complain, that becomes additional advocacy to the province in my mind, maybe naive or optimistic. But yeah, that's where I do have some hesitation about adding new parking requirements for settlement areas. And so that's, the only sticking point for me in this.
One of our challenges, particularly on some of the smaller lots in the master plan communities, Britannia Beach being a perfect example, is we already have complaints about parking. And it's a real problem in that area. And so I think to remove a parking requirement and allow people to have suites, it's just gonna drive that parking problem to be much worse.
Okay. I think everything that has needed to be said has been said on this topic. Unless there's any burning last things. I think we can move forward with the recommendations. This is on the area C amendments.
Moved by Director Mack. Seconded by Director Demare.
Comments from anybody? Okay. Unless I hear them, I'll call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Ms. McKay.
Thank you.
We'll move on to Ms. Dewar. Area D,
Yes.
significant changes
Thank
that are
you.
different from what we've already heard. Thank you.
So my name is Claire Dewar. I'm a senior planner here at the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District. I will give a really high level overview of the zoning amendments proposed in Area D with respect to Bill 44 housing statutes. And I'm really just going to focus in on the analysis section that looks at Area D, as we have heard from my colleagues on some of the broader changes that are applicable throughout the electoral areas. So as we has been noted, there are restricted zones, and that these restricted zones are really the residential zones, that the restricted zones do not include non-residential zones like agriculture, commercial, industrial that may have residential uses. Really, we're looking at everywhere else. So in Area D, restricted zones are our rural zones, our residential zones of Black Tusk Pinecrest, our residential zones at Britannia Beach, our residential zones at Fray Creek, and our comprehensive development zones. So that's really just providing the frame for where we're looking at this small scale multi-unit housing legislation landing. And then we also look to our regional growth strategy because in Area D, we do have areas where growth is being directed, and this is our master plan communities. So that comes into play when we consider our GS urban containment boundary. And then we also have site servicing in some areas in electoral area D, being Black Tusk. But this is currently a strata system, so it's not contemplated under this legislation. But we do have Pinecrest, Britannia Beach, and Fray Creek that are on SLRD water and sewer. So if we look at the small scale multi-unit housing densities, as has been discussed already, the secondary suites and accessory dwelling units are required in a number of zones. In Area D, these are landing in our rural zones, RR1, RR2, RR3, and RR4, as well as our residential zones of Black Tusk and Pinecrest, and our comprehensive development, one zone being Porto Cove is being grouped in here because they don't have any servicing. So in these specific zones, we are considering one secondary suite and one ADU on parcels 1 hectare or greater. Then we can look to where we may see 3 to 4 housing units land in the SLRD, and this is the only area D is the only area in the SLRD where that is being contemplated, and this is specifically in our RGS designated master plan communities. So if we look, and I won't get into the specific factors, but those are in the staff report and happy to answer any questions there. But if we look at specifically what zones we see these housing units landing, we have the Britannia Beach residential zones, Britannia Beach Residential 1, Britannia Beach Residential 2, and Britannia Beach Residential 3. And we are suggesting a secondary suite or an auxiliary dwelling unit be permitted here. The zoning already allows parcels over 1.5 hectares, 1.15 hectares to allow a cottage, and we're suggesting that that be brought down to 1 hectare. And then to note is that the SLRD or SLRD staff are recommending that the SLRD apply for an extension due to lack of water capacity in Britannia North for any additional density. So the province is suggesting that we should be requiring 3 to 4 housing units in these areas. And we have concerns with regards to the water reservoir and lack of capacity. And this is one area that we're suggesting an extension be applied for. And if we look to Furry Creek, we also see the minimum number of dwelling units per parcel being 3 to 4, depending on the size. We have a couple townhouse developments already, so this will only be applicable in the Furry Creek Residential 3 and the CD3 zones, as the other 2 zones are already built out as townhouse developments. I won't really get into sort of the building type, but really we're trying to enable flexibility in what those dwelling units could look like. When we say 3 units, it could be a principal housing unit, a secondary suite, and an ADU, or a duplex and an ADU. So there's lots of ways to get to 3 to 4 units. As has been mentioned, there are relaxations to height requirements, removing floor space ratio requirements, and some parking requirements have been reduced. So I do want to take a moment to speak to this Britannia Beach North extension recommendation. And this is one of the recommendations that the board will consider passing. So the province has put together a bulletin that outlines 3 categories for which a local government may apply for an extension. I'll speak to the second option, which is where we see Britannia Beach North falling into. And so it states that the infrastructure that services the area where the small scale multi-unit housing would apply is such that compliance by June 30th is likely to increase a risk to health, public safety, or the environment in that area. And so we have spoken with the Environmental Services Department. They too share concerns about the existing water reservoir and its capacity. It has been an issue in Britannia Beach and a consideration for any type of development in Britannia Beach, the reservoir and its capacity. So staff are suggesting that reaching that 3 to 4 units in Britannia Beach would be very challenging, and instead to focus on the secondary suite or the auxiliary dwelling unit option, and thus apply to the province for the extension. We need to apply before June 1st. We need a council or board resolution directing this submission of an extension application. And it is recommended that extension applications be submitted 45 days prior to considering adoption of the bylaw, so we're in good timing. I did want to note there are some aspects like around what's requested in that extension, and there is a piece where when if we were to go ahead and submit an application, we have to map out the area, but we also need to indicate an estimate of when basically when infrastructure will be upgraded to allow for this increase in density. And so internally as staff, we've kind of discussed, at what point could we see infrastructure being updated, or what type of date or estimated date? We don't have any proposals or project plans underway to expand this infrastructure at this time. So we have, loosely discussed the idea of, maybe the timeframe that's submitted with this application is if this land were to be incorporated and there's a tax base to thus support any type of required upgrades or maintenance and operations and whatnot. I think we need, like in this specific case, we have a limited tax base, and just different mechanisms by which we can generate funds to pay for these types of infrastructure upgrades that are more complicated than in a municipal setting. So that's all a little bit complicated. I'm happy to take any questions on that. I don't know. The only other piece that I had highlighted in my staff report, which I already spoke to, was around the off-street parking requirements and suggesting that we put a policy in our OCP to really suggest that we can consider reducing our parking requirements a lot more once we have transit systems in place to offset some of the potential challenges.
Thank you. I think Jen wanted to say something. You're going to step away for.
I do, yeah. Thank you very much for the report. I find this troubling because we're effectively, not we, but that area is effectively doubling from no housing to 1,050 new units coming in a very short order. Can the letter in the submission make that clear that we're adding significant density to this area? We're not, I believe the intention and the spirit of the legislation was to acknowledge that in areas of single family, older homes where, it hasn't changed and they haven't added any new density, and there's a real need to increase the number of beds in spaces. That's what this legislation was meant to attack. And adding more density on top of non-existent density it seems like we're trying to do, I just feel like that argument could be made that like, hey, we're on board, we're adding, we're upzoning, we're doing the thing, like we should be good. So any conversation to that effect, Ms. Dewar or Ms. Needham?
Yeah, so thank you. So through the chair, I think that is important to note in our letter that our new master plan communities of Furry Creek that was recently zoned last year, as well as Britannia South, which is working through their zoning amendment process. These are providing for much higher densities and are meeting the density that the province is seeking, and specifically around small scale multi-unit housing. We added at Furry Creek, the only change we had to make there was to add an auxiliary dwelling unit provision for all settings. So it was very minor. We already were providing for a range of building types, a range of densities, the same as being done at Britannia South. So those systems, those locations have the infrastructure in place to accommodate this growth. Where we are challenged is in our older community of Britannia North that has limited infrastructure and existing built form that is challenging from other constraints about fire separation and whatnot too, which I won't get into.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I have Director Herford, Director Mack, and Director Rainbow. And Director Bennigan.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is, having dealt with this, sort of ongoing at the municipality, my municipal role, I think, yeah, this is really interesting context. I agree with the exception. I think that makes sense. Perhaps this is an area of advocacy that the board can take on if we felt like that was something that we really wanted to push to facilitate, though there's likely other areas that could use the investment for a greater return, but maybe that's where a conversation is had. But my question is around the recommendation for the OCP amendment. Is that language something we need to concern ourselves with now? I think that, okay, I look forward to that discussion but quickly would be that the off-street parking requirements, as it stated, says off-street parking requirements will be reduced to 1 space per. I think that could be like reassessed, or a further reduction could be reassessed once, and I would use frequent transit services in place, not regular, because I think, yeah, we don't regularly see 15-minute transit service, to me that'd be frequent, but I'd like to have that discussion, but setting the target as to what the appropriate piece would be at that future state, we would want to vary that by the time we got there. So I think leaving it more open is appropriate. Okay, thank you. There was sort of a question in and amongst there.
Director Mack.
So the water issue, is that in relation to fire flows or domestic use or both?
Through the chair, both. Yeah.
All right, Director Rainbow.
Yeah, just with regard to the water in Britannia, when McDonald's started their development, we required a new reservoir. The development's not complete yet, not fully occupied. And I'm just wondering, once it is fully occupied, once the commercial is up and running, once all those townhouses are occupied, would that give us an opportunity to sort of reassess whether we have enough water?
Yeah, through the chair, the additional reservoir capacity that was added to accommodate the McDonald development was basically right-sized for their development. And so it's there to service that project.
Okay.
There's no excess capacity. Yeah.
Okay. Comments regarding parking. I think when we're looking, if you live in a floodplain, then walking to get the 15-minute transit is fine. If you live at the top of Goat Ridge Drive, and I doubt very much that the transit's going right up there. That's a heck of a long hike down the hill and then back up the hill. And I want to be really careful about how we restricted parking there. So that's it. And there are a lot of people with suites in Britannia right now, and I just made that comment that some of them we don't know about. So I'll just leave it there.
And Director Pettingill.
Yeah, a couple, question first, for some of the master plan communities in area D, we are going above and beyond the provincial requirements in terms of density. I'm wondering, it seems to me then we're foregoing CACs and set aside where they would flow, but I assume someone would generally want them. So is there a reason why we would choose to forego them by pre-zoning?
Yes, thank you. So through the chair, we are not, to my recollection, going above and beyond. We are specific to, well, in Britannia Beach, Britannia North, we're proposing less and suggesting we apply for an extension in Furry Creek.
Ms. Stewart, can I just ask, when you say we're applying for an extension, do you mean like an exception? Or
There is no exception. It's actually, the language is extension, and that's why we're hoping to just use some point down the line date. Because we don't have any plans to upgrade our infrastructure anytime soon. I just wanted to find, So we aren't, in our master plan communities, we are just following what is recommended and required, or required, really. We're recommending what is required in terms of density. And that's at 3 to 4 units. Because we're serviced, we are required to provide for 3 to 4 housing units on lots in our master plan communities.
Okay, all right, so and then I will go, thank you, go to the parking. For me, you know, area C, because it was, I think in my mind, only one neighborhood, I was on the threshold, decided to just support as is. But here, from my recollection, a big part of the pitch for the rezoning and what we did with these communities was that this can work without being car dependency, and this was gonna be transit oriented. And here we're already requiring parking minimums, and I find that very challenging. And I understand people may be complaining, but I think this is a case where we need to direct those complaints to the province and to advocacy, or we need to rethink how we have or are designing, and you know, at least one of these doesn't have its final approval. Maybe rethink that, because if we are approving with a built-in need and parking problems already, for me, that's sort of a no-go. You know, in fairness, Squamish has similar requirements, and speaking as an SLRD director, maybe it's an opportunity for the SLRD to show Squamish some leadership on parking in this instance. And I, you know, I don't always win that battle in Squamish either, but I could try. But yeah, for me, that's a bit of a challenge, especially given, you know, the context in which we did the approvals for these areas, so. Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize, that should have been after the question, I guess, but.
Thank you, Chris. Tony.
Yeah, given that this is an extension that we're applying for, the implication there is that somewhere down the road, we're gonna have to do it. So is there an opportunity when we apply for the extension to clearly state that in Britannia, the problem is water? And so if the province really wants us to increase the density there, which we could do if the water was available, can they supply the water for us? And is there a grant available? I'm being serious.
Why
I'm
not?
being serious. You know,
We'd like some water in bees.
that reservoir probably was what, $2 million? I would think.
I don't know the price.
But it's in that range. So that's sort of what we'd be asking for you. And that's not very much. If $2 million, seriously, it's not. $2 million would provide 50 more housing units, which it could. Then I think that's a reasonable ask.
So that's being noted.
Yeah,
Being noted.
yeah, well.
Well done. And without Jen here, I'm the chair, and so I think I can ask for someone to make a motion on this 6.4, moved by Director Rainbow, both, all three of that. Angela? Yes. The first two that,
too, and then we'll do the
all
last one.
right, seconded by Director Matt, yeah. All in favor? Yes,
I would like to test an amendment.
okay. Just because Jen's not chairing, you're gonna be.
Yeah, sorry. And I'm going to test without the additional parking requirement in the master plan communities.
That's the additional parking in the master plan communities.
Without the additional requirement.
Would be your amendment.
Yeah.
Would somebody like to second that?
So just, would you be able to provide the page on our agenda where that language exists, just to make sure we're all in the same spot?
Sorry, I moved the page. It's
Or someone?
Yeah, so through the chair, it's page 8 on the staff report, speaks to the parking space requirements, current and new. And
Page 8, isn't it?
101 to 137 urgent.
So. I'm just waiting for them to find it and then to see if there's a secondary, but first of all.
Sorry, page 135, is that where we end up with this?
131 is the start of the report.
Yeah, just was looking for the specific regulations.
Yeah, so page 108.
Is it the heading off-street parking space requirements? Because that's not on 108 on mine.
Yes.
That's what we're looking at. Okay.
So striking the whole section?
Oh, sorry, that was not my intent.
Through the chair, I believe you're speaking to just there's the last two bullets highlight a new cottage requirement and a new accessory dwelling unit
Yeah,
requirement.
without the new.
Yeah, so those are those are new proposed parking requirements, and one mean that there was no accessory dwelling unit previously. And the other addition was cottage because there just were they didn't speak to any parking with respect to cottages in the current bylaw.
Thank you. So on page 8 of the report, just the last two bullets that are new regarding parking. So is everybody?
Which is page 108 of their agenda.
Correct.
So your intent here is to say that if someone builds a new cottage, they don't have to provide a parking space.
Yeah, market decides.
Sorry,
They can, if they want to build one, but we're not gonna require it.
why not?
Well, wait, I think we should have a seconder for the amendment.
Well, I'm trying to understand what your amendment means.
Okay.
You second it.
I don't want to second.
I'll second it.
Okay.
I'll second it.
Seconded by Director Crompton. Go ahead.
Well, I think the mover would speak to it.
So yeah, the-
Point of order, just to make sure that we're on the right.
and as I said probably too much to before, the intent is to, these were proposed and argued and discussed as not being transit or car dependent communities, that we could make it work with transit. And then we're already, in my mind, requiring and making car dependence mandatory and part of the cost, a mandatory part of the cost. And, some places are looking at parking maximums and not allowing new parking. I'm not going that far. I'm just sort of saying, let's not require it. Because, to my mind, again, it's completely contrary to the a part of the justification for approving these is that they would work without requiring parking. Here we are requiring parking in cars.
Yes.
I'm gonna break the silence because I'd like to know what you guys think about this, because like living in a rural community, it's different than this, so. Any more input on this? Like, I'm a little surprised that you're going, but I understand why you're saying.
Well, Sal would like to provide some.
I think that you're gonna need spaces. People are gonna own vehicles, whether they're a motorcycle, an EV vehicle. Sure, they can take transit, but they're gonna have vehicles. And you have to make sure that they've got a place to park those off street. And yeah, they can commute back and forth to whatever, if they're going from Britannia Beach to Squamish to work, they can commute by bus and stuff like that. But if they want to go up into our area, you're gonna need a vehicle. Period. There is no other way to get to our area or to get into provincial parks or wherever they're gonna go to travel. So you have to have someplace for them to store their vehicles. Either that or have a park, someplace that they can park them, they can take a bus to get them to go wherever they want, go on holidays or whatever.
Director Mack and then Director Rupert and then Director.
Yeah, I agree with what Sal's saying. Maybe in downtown Squamish, downtown Whistler, even downtown Pemberton now. You can walk, ride your bike, you can do whatever to access. But when you get out into the electoral areas, we have no transit, none. The only transit you got is what you provide. And that's not coming anytime soon. So I think it's really important to understand that. So, and the other thing about people going from Britannia to Squamish, they may be going to Vancouver, North Vancouver, to go to work or doctors or whatever. So, you know, maybe sometime in the future, when the areas are more built out and connected, and we actually do have transit. We have transit now, but it's so sparse, like here in Pemberton, if somebody comes in from the Upper Meadows or Devine, Darcy area to come in, even with the park and ride that's going to be built, if they're going to Worcester to go to a doctor's appointment, the chances of them stopping here and getting on a bus are not very great, because once they get to Whistler, they may have to wait for 5 or 6 hours to catch the returning bus. And maybe they've only got a 1 hour appointment timeline. So they're going to drive there, do their appointment and go home. So, you know, like, we have to think about this stuff. It's not all about, you know, what's happening in your municipalities and how tight everything is. And you have transport, you have buses traveling on a regular basis. We don't have that. Like I say, in the outlying areas, we don't have one bus, never mind every hour or half the day type of thing. So people are gonna have cars whether you like it or not.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to the mover for bringing this suggestion forward so we can have this conversation. I think there is a tension between, you know, a parking space versus somewhere for folks to live. So when I think about those tensions and the specific properties that we're talking about here, I find it compelling. I'm curious around, we do have that requirement around a secondary suite, and that need to provide that parking space might be a limiting factor for realizing this type of development, which we're looking to encourage in an area where we've directed density, which I think is distinctly different than the rest of the areas. So Director Mack's points are very valid for that area. This is an area where we've, during the rezoning process and all the rest, we talked about complete communities, walkable communities, livable communities, the need for employment spaces, like all that stuff, that complete community piece. And I think there will be some growing pains here. I think this is a worthwhile discussion, but without consideration around the overall parking deeper, I'd rather have a deeper conversation around the parking requirements, period, than just these two. Because I see some opportunities with secondary suites. Maybe we look at other reductions, and maybe that transit service is where we trigger that 15-minute threshold for transit, for that consideration, I think is a bit lofty, considering that it would need to be a regional perspective for the transit. This isn't just about getting to Squamish, if that happens to be the first sort of step of having some more connectivity in the transit systems. So I think that for an opening, I'm actually not going to support the amendment. However, this is a discussion I expect to have when we consider the OCP amendment. And I think the language there and what those thresholds are something that we really need to consider. And just by allowing those developments in the first place, we've driven the need for transit to be there. So transit needs to be there for those places to function. And that was a consideration of those rezoning. But I think it's the place to have that is this bigger discussion is around further assessing the parking restrictions or parking requirements during that OCP amendment discussion and when that gets triggered. So I'm not going to support the amendment, but I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. We have Director Rainbow and then Director Compton, and then I think we should vote on this amendment so that we can finish at least this portion of the agenda before Jen returns for your hospital board meeting at 3 o'clock. Go ahead, Tony.
I agree with Director Massett. Regardless of what your local day-to-day travel requirements are, which may be able to be met by transit. You live out of the metro area, you're gonna need a vehicle, at least one vehicle, maybe two, depending on the family circumstances. And you need to park that somewhere. If we say to somebody, you can build a cottage, we've got this lot here, you can build a cottage, you don't have to provide a parking space. So they want to landscape the whole thing, make it look beautiful. Where do they park their car? They park it on a public road. What gives them the right to do that? That's a valuable piece of land that they're taking up with their car. And we're saying to them, that's okay, you can do that. I think that's something we should consider when we're looking at parking. That maybe people, if we want to own a car, you have to be able to park it on a piece of land that you own and you pay taxes on, not on the public road. And then in the winter time, in Furry Creek and in Britannia Beach, it becomes particularly difficult because if you're parking on the road, it impedes the ability of the snowplows to keep those roads clear. Keep that in mind as well. And on transit in general, you know, I can see transit coming to Furry Creek at some time. Great. I think it might, it could conceivably come down and sort of swing around right by Oliver's Landing, which is where I live. Great, I can just get out and walk to the bus. But there's plenty of places in Furry Creek where that's not going to happen, where you're not going to be able to just get it and leave and walk to the bus. I cannot see us getting away from private vehicles. Certainly not in my lifetime. I suggest perhaps not in yours either.
Good,
Thank you.
and then we're gonna.
I did think interesting use of the free market by Director Pettengill to suggest that this is a decision that the market can decide for us, and that if people want to build parking, they can. We're not stopping them from building it if this were to pass. I, however, am compelled by what Director Herford said, so I'll be voting against it. I just think this is arbitrary and it's very limited. And I don't really connect to the idea of allowing a cottage only because it's new to be the one that doesn't generate a parking space, but a secondary suite is required to do one. So I am eager for the concept of this coming back for a broader conversation. And I do think we should be making housing more affordable by spending less on taking care of people's cars. But I'll be voting against it.
Thank you. So voting on the amendment, all those in favor? One lonely vote, opposed. All right. Okay. Is that okay, Angela? We can proceed back to the main motion. Would you like to make the?
It's the first two that's, I think, well, I already moved that, didn't I?
We moved it.
Sorry.
Oh, no, because we had a,
Because we had an amendment
oh, I
and
see.
then it failed.
The amendment failed, but the main motion's still going.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
So now we're voting on the main motion.
yeah.
Thank you. We did we do that? Okay. And now we're going to go third that.
No, we didn't.
We haven't voted about the amendment. Okay, so in favor of the first two that's as moved,
So I just wanted to speak to it if I could.
yes?
So just, sorry, I know again. Yeah, just thank you to staff for wading through all of this. I think everything that laid out made great sense of something that is quite complicated. I do find the concept of adding or changing the goalposts we hear often about from proponents of development around all number of regulations that move over time. And as an elected official interacting with this, I think it's an interesting concept where we're changing something that we just approved at a very specific level, but that's the nature of the beast as far as what the province is doing, but it makes for really challenging conversations, just like the one we just had about this whole parking piece, because they did require tremendous amount of consideration from this board to arrive at what we've approved. And now before the shovel goes in the ground, the goalposts move on us as well. So it's really challenging. And I want to acknowledge that for the folks in the community that, you know, think that this one thing was approved and now this other, the goalpost has moved there a little bit, but that's thanks to our friends at the province. So thank you for making sense of it all and happy to support.
Okay, all in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, vote motion carried, and we need a third
I
that,
move the third that.
moved by Director Rainbow, seconded by Director Hoffel.
And if I could just say.
Yes, please.
I saw the scribbling away when I made that comment about water. Do you feel you're able to include that in the letter? The application for extension?
Yes, thank you. So through the chair, the application staff will fill out the application. I believe it requires chair, board chair and CAO signature, but we can capture the piece around potentially the province funding and a long time horizon and highlight the CD Britannia South and Fray Creek developments that have just been or are going through zoning amendment processes that contemplate the densities that they're seeking.
Thank you.
Director Burford.
Is it, so sometimes I have curiosities, I don't know how much staff work this is, but I'm curious around return on investment from the province, say I'm making a $2 million investment in this area, like do we have an idea of what the potential, like if it was to build out to the new regulation, like what that return, is that something that's easy to articulate, or is this like a 6-month project that I just am contemplating? Because I think that the province is clear that the province needs to step up and invest in infrastructure to actually realize these goals. But they're unlikely to do it everywhere, and we're unlikely to want it to also happen everywhere necessarily. So I don't know, is there anything you can do to help me with understand these potentially?
Yes, I mean, I think Britannia, through the chair, we see these types of challenges specifically in these historic communities of Britannia North, as well as say in like Braylorn, where it's like very limited infrastructure, limited tax base, small pipes. There's a lot of pieces there that would require upgrading. It's not just like adding a second reservoir on top of like volunteer fire departments. And there's a lot of constraints to higher density building in these areas. And then to Chair Ford's point is like our board has worked through processes to support growth in these communities in specific areas that have the servicing, that are working to address our fire concerns. And I think that is a great point to highlight, is like we are encouraging growth in our master plan communities. This is where we are requiring the developers to build the servicing so that it works. And then we have these smaller historic communities that are connected but aren't connected to the same servicing.
So just for that, that's great. I think my point is when we write when the letter's drafted, I have no problem pushing a province that, hey, if you want to make this investment, something could happen. But I also want to make sure that it's not, that we haven't had that discussion, that's the push we want to make that happen. I think they're unlikely to receive a check. We're unlikely to receive a check that we don't, from this, but just to be mindful of that, so we can have that discussion in the appropriate place.
Ready for those?
Question.
Oh, question from Director.
So that's a lot of work,
Leave
but do you know how much a typical water service costs? Like, wouldn't that be something you could put in there and say, if you're interested in sending us a check, this is how big it should be if you want to actually deliver it? No, not a chance.
There are, like, the pipes are sized to a certain size right now, and I don't know if they have to be upgraded in order to then accommodate 4 units. That would be a whole research project.
Somebody knows that somewhere and needs to write that letter.
I think, sorry if I could, that's the other half of my point is like, whatever that number is, like, what can we actually be realized there? Because I don't know that those numbers relate in a favorable way.
Director Mack.
Tyson.
Director Brompton.
Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you. That was not, you were getting a good answer. I apologize.
Yeah, I just think that the province and the feds have done a knee-jerk reaction on all this stuff without doing their homework. Because most of these communities do not have the infrastructure. Even the major cities don't have the infrastructure. And I think it was a good political move on their part to get somebody's attention and think, wow, they're doing something. The federal liberal government made this promise in 2015, they were gonna open up all these federal lands and such to this exact thing. Now they've made that same promise again, and it's verbatim. So, you know, they haven't done their homework, obviously. And I guarantee you, if you looked at the fire flows in Britannia and these small communities, they might be very suspect as it is. So we don't need to go any further with that. Sal's got a perfect example in Goldbridge. They do not have, you know, fire flow.
I think through the growing community fund, we delegated quite a bit of money, thousands of dollars to asset management. What we need to do with that Braylord or with Britannia is do a condition assessment and asset management plan to get all the details that you need. And utilizing that money, so you contract that out. And they can calculate out how many more accessory suites and so on and so forth through that process. So you can get some costs associated with what you need to do to be able to put more housing units in there. That's my recommendation.
Do you like to vote on the
That'd be a good idea.
third that? Okay. In favor? Opposed? Seeing none, motion carried. Recess for the hospital, meeting. See the sky that is.
Yeah.